And so continuing on, continuity and change, there'll be all kinds of questions. What's going to happen? Uh, Frankly, we just don't know. And so now we will start chapter 15. Uh, in rural Kentucky, in urban Kentucky, uh, rich, poor, young, old, black, white, uh, men, women, eastern, central, and western Kentuckians. There were different classes, different ethnicities. There was no unity within these groups. Some were willing to embrace the new changes, and some wanted to remain the same. They were not ready for change. Most Kentuckians traveled little. There's no cars. Have to remember, no cars back then. So they mainly traveled by foot, horse, or mule. You always stayed close to where you were born. At this time, 1/4 of Kentuckians were illiterate. We mainly relied upon oral traditions. And on page 219, uh, does mention just some witches. Uh, so make sure that you do look at page 219 to read more about that. There was one supposed witch in Owen County in 1869 who was arrested and was presented to a grand jury. She was not indicted for being a witch. In 1898, there was another woman was supposedly burned as a witch in Fleming County. According to oral traditions, it did happen. The fear of the unknown, especially, or there's a fear of the unknown, especially in the eastern part of the state. Yet, some still did travel. Some Kentuckians continued to travel. Some were educated, and some had visions of a future. And so, what is a typical Kentuckian? Kind of difficult. You may not be able to come up with a scenario. It depends upon what part of the state you live in, the social economic status. Each of us are unique. However, typical or not, again, most Kentuckians did resist change. This time the population is declining. Immigrants, we do not have many immigrants in Kentucky. 1 in 20 are foreign born. In Louisville, 20% immigrants, Irish, German descent. There's a German-Irish newspaper. There's little in immigration from other states. And Kentucky, we become a self-contained state. 90% of the population at this time was born in Kentucky. Can't almost quite compare the numbers, but growing up as a child in Lebanon, Kentucky, I may have mentioned this to you all before, but in Lebanon, Kentucky, back in the 70s, 80s, the majority of the population was Catholic. We had one Catholic church. That's where the majority of the people attended church. There were Baptist church, Presbyterian, but almost everybody that you spoke to, you were Catholic in one sense or another. And also, if your last name was Mattingly or Spalding, there were a lot of Mattingleys and Spaldings. in the 70s, 80s, and in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Also, a lot of bells. Also, as far as like with family names, you could look in the phone book in the 80s. Go to Mattingly, go to the M's, see Mattingly, and there would just be pages and pages and pages of Mattingly's. If you go to the S's, lots of pages for Spalding's as well. Families, they were the core of life. Most lived in a rural setting. 4 out of 5 families lived in a rural setting. Life was ruled by seasons and weather. In the 1940s, electricity came along. Homes were uninsulated, just may have had a fireplace. If you're lucky to have a feather bed growing up back in the 1800s, duck feathers, chicken feathers. I've not slept on a feather bed. I've not had a feather pillow, but I've had some students and other classes who have mentioned to me that they've had a feather pillow, and they've told me it was the softest. Rested really well. The food's homegrown. Did your own hunting, fishing, fruit trees, beehives. If you didn't grow it, you didn't eat it, unless it was coffee, flour, or sugar. Also, there was a clear division of work among men and women. There were certain jobs that women did and certain jobs that men did. Sometimes families would meet or friends would meet at just social places, at the church and the country store. You still may see some of that today. Some friends may go to McDonald's, have coffee, just chit chat, just to catch up with each other. They may meet once a week on Fridays. I know some that they meet once a week. They'll meet either on Friday or Saturday, and some will just go every day. The store was central, was necessary. Everyone had a charge account. No one had money till the crops came in, and by no means could children charge for any reason. I remember that my aunt's dad owned a gas station when I was growing up, and so people would come in and they would charge their gas. That was something common back in the 80s, 70s, 80s that people just continue to do. I'm not for sure anymore about that. I know my dad charged his medication at the pharmacy, and he would pay that off once a month at the beginning of the month and then charge his medicine for that month. So he had a month-to-month bill. Court days, important. Who's doing what, who's suing who, get all dressed up, go down to the courthouse, and just see who's being sued for the day or for the week. Eastern Kentucky, they were slow to modernize. Lexington was thought to be Lexington was thought to be typical Kentucky by people who did not live in Kentucky. It was actually Louisville that was typical Kentucky. In 1900, 1 in 5 lived in larger towns, so approximately 2,500 people. The dress was typical rural. The guys did not wear underclothes in the summertime. Some had 2 pairs of shoes, 1 pair for church and a pair for school, while others went barefoot in the summer. That's just something that I just couldn't do, going barefoot in the summer, especially as far as outside. I'm tender-footed, so me walking on gravel, rocks, it's just too painful. But if you take me to a beach, sand, I'm perfectly fine with that. My cousins could just walk down their gravel driveway, and some would just run down it, and it wouldn't bother them at all. Louisville, in the 1900s, or in 1900, the population was well over 200,000. It was 5 times larger. It was 5 times larger than any other Kentucky city. Everything that happened in Louisville made news. The Souvenir Sporting Guide. And you've probably seen what that was. I was just getting ready to ask what you would think when you would think of a sporting guide. Some people would just think about sports, basketball, football, baseball, the typical sports. However, the Souvenir Sporting Guide was actually a magazine that pointed out where you could find brothels. Louisville was prosperous. Population consisted of blacks, foreign immigrants. There was public schools, restaurants. Jobs were plentiful. Louisville was 2 cities. You had the riverfront and, of course, the sophisticated Louisville. Louisville did have more vice. When you lived in Louisville, you depended on others for livelihood. You did not grow your own food to eat, and you're just working for other people in order to purchase your food. For leisure, people found their own entertainment. They played musical instruments, did a lot of reading, played board games, also lots of talking, visiting, hunting, fishing, picnics, go on hay rides. The Chautauqua. It's just named for a group that would come to the state of Kentucky. 2 weeks of gatherings. There would be meetings, seminars, and at these gatherings you would also just learn how to do things, just different things. And this is in Owensboro, so I have probably mispronounced the name of that group. So if you are from Owensboro, if you're near that area, or if you know, you can send me an email or call my office and just leave me a voicemail on the correct pronunciation. Also for leisure, circuses, carnivals, county fairs came to town. Springs and spas in Kentucky for the middle and the upper class. There will be some travel required to go to the springs and the spas. Opera House in Louisville and Lexington. Minstrel shows, vaudeville. Just sports, plenty of sports. Swimming, riding, skating, bicycling, tennis. Again, the upper class mostly would play tennis, croquet, football, baseball, basketball was not popular until the 1920s. And after the war, some of the activities did change. There was lots of destruction. May not have had a brother, father, siblings, and it just wasn't much fun just to kind of go out to enjoy these activities if you didn't have your brother who may have been your best friend, or your dad who you may consider your best friend. However, still most worked and lived in long established patterns. Lives would change little, but there would be change over the horizon as we would come into the 20th century, the 1920s. And so this concludes the presentation on Chapter 15.